we will make sure. So if you have any questions throughout this, for sure, feel free, drop them in the chat. And then at the end, I can go through them and try to my best to answer any questions that you might have. And then again, a replay will be emailed out, and I will also send these slides out. So don't feel like you need to take super careful notes if you were planning on doing that. And my sources are also cited at the end of on the last slide, so you'll have full access to those as well. Before I jump right into the topic, I'll introduce myself a little bit. I know a lot of you know me, but for those who maybe don't, my name is Amy, and I am the owner, founder of Blue Raspberry Design, which is a sustainable branding, graphic design, and web design studio located in Wisconsin. So everything that we do, we strive to be as eco-friendly as possible. And we also love to do research. And one of those research topic points is for green and sustainable web design, which not a ton of people are talking about. Some are. And so it's one of those topics super near and dear to my heart because I've just always loved web design. And I think it's so important to be aware of. Um, to start out, let's really like define sustainable web design, just so we're all kind of working off the same definition. Sustainable web design, green web design, kind of using those terms interchangeably. It's really web design that is beneficial for both the planet and then accessible for its people. So obviously with sustainability, we always strive to be as low impact as possible to the planet. And a big part of that with web design is the energy needed, especially the electricity with servers, keeping them up and running, the energy that we use as designers and also users of the web. And then cooling actually the servers and all of the components is one of the biggest drains of energy. And then secondly, making the web accessible for its people because, the planet is our home. And if we're doing our best to make everything very low impact for the planet, but then we're leaving people behind, it kind of defeats the purpose of doing things sustainably. So always making sure to account for disabilities, economic gaps, technology gaps, really, whatever we can do to make it as accessible as possible. So the 6 guidelines that I want to talk about today come from the Sustainable Web Manifesto that was created by Whole Grain Digital. They're a WordPress agency located in London. They're doing some really good things in the sustainable space for web design. They are the ones that created the carbon calculator for websites. If any of you are familiar with that, that's one of the tools that I use a ton. And I didn't really want to reinvent the wheel because their guidelines they cover pretty much all the bases. But I did want to talk more in detail about them because their manifesto, it's clear, straight to the point, simple. But for those that maybe aren't as familiar with sustainable web design, it can be a little confusing and have a lot to unpack. So I wanted to expand upon their points and really give some clear ways as to how any web designer, graphic designer, developer can implement these in their work and in their studio. So let's start with number 1 right away, clean. This is probably the most straightforward one. The services we provide and services we use will be powered by renewable energy. So the absolute best thing with your website that you can do is switch over to a server that is hosted on renewable energy. There's a ton of green web hosts out there. Some use 100% renewable energy. Some use some renewable energy because they just pull off the grid, and then where they can't use their renewable energy, they offset it by buying carbon offsets. And then some green web hosts only carbon offset and they don't actually really use any renewable energy, which can be good, but can also be detrimental. So the best thing that you can do is just kind of start with looking at a few and really dig into their credentials. There isn't a one-size-fits-all web host just because of server location, packaging needs for how much space you need. If you need just one account for your own website, or if you're a web developer and you need reseller sharing of servers. So It's really based on what fits in your budget, what fits in your needs, and what can be as green as possible in those spaces. And this does come with a few strings attached because places like Squarespace, Wix, you don't get to choose your host through them. So Squarespace doesn't use renewable energy. If you're building through them, you're kind of stuck in their standard non-green energy, which isn't the best. Eventually, hopefully, they move towards sustainable energy because a lot of people do like their platform, and I can't blame them. It's easy to use, makes great websites visually and everything. So that makes sense. And then Wix actually doesn't host their own websites. They use hosting through multiple third parties, one of them being Google. Um, for Google, they use renewable energy and they also offset their carbon. So that's a little bit trickier of a situation to unpack. And you can't choose whether you're actually going to end up on a Google host server. So a little difficult. But for those that use WordPress, use builders that you have the luxury to choose your own web host, choosing green is the best. And looking towards the future for this guideline, in a perfect world, we would all be using renewable energy to build our websites and provide our services, but that's not accessible to a lot of people. I mean, I currently rent still. I think my landlord would be upset with me if I put solar panels on the roof. Not that I could even afford to do it anyway. So just like looking to the future, a good goal. Next, number two for the guidelines would be efficient. So the products and services we provide will use the least amount of energy and material resources possible. This builds directly off of the first one. I mean, as not everybody has renewable energy when they visit your website, you want to make sure that they're producing the least amount of carbon when they visit it, which is using the least amount of energy. And then for material resources, for websites, those are going to be looking at kilobytes, megabytes, really the file sizes behind what is on your website. The best way to make your website efficient is to simplify and optimize all of the assets on your website. This includes images, which are usually the biggest bloat on a web page. So you want to make sure that you're not uploading like 3,000 pixel wide images onto your website because it's absolutely not needed. And you want to make sure you're using the correct file types. I know sometimes we get in the habit, we don't do this upfront already, but if you're saving like all of your photographs as PNGs instead of JPEGs, that's going to add a ton of bloat to your website. For videos, I personally recommend removing videos as much as possible and not having them on your website. A lot of times, images and text can be a good placeholder, like replacement for them, and then link to them, maybe hosting them elsewhere for platforms that are better suited. But you absolutely need videos on your website. Make sure that they're compressed, optimized, and that they do not autoplay because autoplaying is a drain on energy. For code, for WordPress specifically, removing unused plugins is going to be helpful, even if there's like a lot of optimizing plugins that you can use. So for like optimizing your images and stuff, if you do the legwork up front and optimize your own images, that's actually going to make your website more efficient than relying on their plugins, because that adds code and processes to your website. And then otherwise, just JavaScript is one of the growing parts of web pages right now, and they can do a lot of cool stuff, a lot of necessary things, but things with like scrolling animations and a couple others, they look really nice, but using them sparingly is going to be helpful. And then next for fonts, you really want to limit the amount of custom fonts that you're using. So limiting to one or two custom fonts is going to be like absolute best practice. And then for all of your body copy, using web safe fonts like Arial, Helvetica, Verdana, Times New Roman. It sounds awful like as a designer because I want to be able to choose my own fonts, but for the optimization, it's not that huge of a trade-off because you can still have your headings in your brand fonts. And then the body copy, it's not going to be as noticeable that it's not 100% on brand. and it speeds up your website quite a bit. And then lastly, just auditing your content, really making sure that you have your goals of your website honed in and deleting things that aren't necessary, that aren't going to help you get to your goals, but maybe you put on there as a just in case you don't need your life story. So just applying that at every step of the way. Okay. Next, sustainable web design should be open. This one has a little bit more to it to unpack. So the products and services we provide will be accessible, allow for the open exchange of information, and allow users to control their data. I want to start by talking about the last half of this one with allowing users to control their data. This is something that bigger companies are definitely getting in hot water with. Facebook, Amazon, particularly, those are the two that come to mind. As design studios that are smaller, we maybe don't run into this as often, but I think it's just good common practice to understand that if you're collecting emails for a newsletter, if you have a client that is doing this, just making sure that you have that conversation, that you say to yourself or them that you're not going to give away this information to other people, that these users have entrusted it to you, and really just following on the ethical line of web design and the data that can come with it. But on the first half of this, with being accessible and then allowing for the open exchange of information, those two kind of go hand in hand and build off of each other. So for accessibility, the biggest thing that people think about with accessibility is accounting for disabilities, which is huge. The Wave accessibility tool is actually a really great starting point for this, and it's not super difficult to get your website to account for screen readers and such. It just takes a little bit of work and digging into your website to do. But the second part of it is accounting for internet connection issues. And I think part of this can be we just take it for granted that we have high speed internet for those of us that do. But developing countries really struggle with this. They don't have as great of internet connections. And then even in countries like in the United States, rural and even metropolitan areas struggle with this as well. Rural users maybe just don't have the access because the infrastructure isn't there, but then also because in metropolitan areas, there's digital poverty as an issue. So when you're making your website efficient and low impact, you're actually helping those with less good internet connections reach your website because it can load much more quickly for them, and they can get the information that they need in a timely manner. So for all of this, you definitely want to consider all of your code files for disabilities, really making sure that your color contrast stands out, along with you have the proper code in place for screen readers to look at, and that you are being upfront with your information. Your page is easily scannable and easy to follow. So just kind of some good design practices in general, but it makes a huge difference. And then when your website is accessible, and if you're not blocking certain people out, you're not using AI to like control what they see, it's going to allow for a really nice open exchange of information. And you're not going to be misleading anybody, which is always a great goal to shoot for. So moving more on the ethics side of web design, the fourth guideline is to have honesty. The products and services we provide will not mislead or exploit users in their design or content. I feel a little weird even talking in this manner because I feel like this is just common sense, at least it should be. It's proving to not be in the world, but especially I think for small businesses, it's much more common. But I want to focus on how we're treating our clients as web designers. Really treating them with respect and being forthcoming in what you do is so important, especially for the web. It can be a unknown, tricky situation for a lot of people. Not many people know the inner workings of the web. They maybe aren't understanding fully what you actually do. And a lot of web agencies take advantage of this. I have seen a lot that offer startup costs for getting a website up and running for dirt cheap, and then they absolutely gouge their users on a monthly maintenance fee. And in the long run, that agency is going to make a lot more money and they're going to take much more from the small business. and the small business owner may not know what they're getting into, because the knowledge just isn't fully there as a broad base with a lot of business owners. And then the second thing that I see a lot with, unfortunately, is web agencies wanting to take their clients' domain names hostage. Um, I operate with a policy that I will never own a client's domain name. I can have access to it to set it up to the servers that I need to, but it's just like I feel like there needs to be that transparency there, that like openness that the client still owns their own domain name just for that extra level of security. I would absolutely never take any domain name hostage, but I don't even want that to be in the realm of possibility. Um, so those are super important when working with any clients. And, just being upfront, accurate, answering the questions because it can be a space of unknown for a lot of people. Okay. Moving on to number 5. This is my favorite, regenerative. It's just such a good word, isn't it? Um, the products and services we provide will support an economy that nourishes people and planet. So, we talked about how to treat your clients. And obviously, in your own web design, you can nourish people and planet because you have full control. But as designers, when we're working with businesses, our primary job is to really lift that business up and increase their impact. So if we're working with terrible businesses like fossil fuel industries or other things that are killing the planet and not taking ownership of their responsibility, we're lifting up their destructive messaging. So it's really important to choose clients and work with those that have a positive impact on the world. Partially, what you want to do for especially smaller businesses is look at who they work with. If they work with terrible people, so maybe they're not fossil fuel themselves, but they primarily work there. Overall, it's kind of a negative chain reaction. And if they're bigger, you might want to look at where they're putting their money. Maybe they're lobbying against anti union legislation or anti environment legislation, whatever it is. Just be conscious of it and screen your clients. There is a huge disclaimer on this guideline, though. If you absolutely need the money to continue to survive and pay your bills and you need to take a less than ideal client, absolutely take that client. I will never ever judge anybody for taking a client that is maybe having a little bit of a negative impact on the world if they need the money, because as long as you strive for this, um, you take that one less than good client, and then maybe your next 10 are absolutely wonderful clients. And overall, that's going to be a net positive. So, absolutely have to pay yourself as well. So, don't feel bad if you have to take some less than ideal clients to survive. It's going to be okay. Okay. Last but not least, sustainable web design should be resilient. The products and services we provide will function in the times and places where people need them most. This last point is all about thinking of the places where we as web designers don't have control. In the web, there's a lot of times where we just kind of have to go with the flow, understand that this is how things are, and just try to work our best to make it work out. In particular, we need to make sure our websites will work across all devices and browsers with ease. So you don't know if your user is going to be using a smartphone, tablet, laptop, desktop, whatever new crazy device they come out with next week, whatever it is, you want to make sure that your website works on them. And in doing so, on the code side, these use media queries. And for being efficient as well as responsive, doing a mobile first design. So the code of the website is all built for mobile, and then the media queries make up the like if statements kind of ish of once the screen's bigger, do these things. And this really works well to make it more efficient on mobile because then there's less code that a mobile device needs to load. And generally, um, mobile devices are going to have much less secure and stable connections, whether you're on data or on Wi-Fi. And then also, they're just not going to have the processing power that computers have. And then secondly, for browsers, there's a ton out there, Firefox, Chrome, Safari. God forbid somebody out there is still using Internet Explorer, but you kind of need to make sure that they're going to work across at least the majority of the most commonly used platforms. And you can't always account for the fact that everybody's going to be constantly updating their browsers. So, for example, back in September, Safari just made an update so that they now support the image format WebP, which is great. It's basically, if you don't know what the image format is, it's similar to a JPEG, but can be much more compressed for the web. However, just because they lit the green light, and I think they were the last of the big browsers to do this, some people might be working on old browsers. So you still need to build in that backup code as a just in case so that people won't be left with no images. They'll just see the less optimized JPEGs as a backup. So those are the six guidelines. And I don't want to just leave the focus on what we can all do individually as designers. Like, that's definitely important, but it's also not going to be the biggest change for the climate. These guidelines, even if we all implement them, if every single web designer out there does this, it's still not going to save the planet. It's going to take extensive and collective action. And part of that is going to be looking at the tech industry. The web is kind of this in between bridge between us as people and designers and the tech industry as a whole. I mean, we all use phones and computers and other technology to access the websites. Without this, we wouldn't have jobs as web designers either. Um, and also, when you're looking at like green design and print, you don't stop at just saying, okay, use recycled paper, everything's fine and dandy. You also want to look at, okay, but what paper companies are actually good to purchase from? How do they get their paper materials? Are they using ethical forestry practices or are they not? And really looking at that supply chain. That's what the tech industry is to the web. It's definitely much more spread out, a little bit more abstract, but I felt like I couldn't do these guidelines justice without talking about this bigger dark cloud that hangs over the digital world and the tech industry. So, as some examples, I want to take these same six guidelines and apply them to the industry as a whole and see where it's failing. And then also, when the industry fails, where do these negative consequences, who do they impact? What are they actually doing? We're going to start right over with number one. And the tech industry itself is not so clean. The very foundation of the tech industry is dirty as we extract metals from the earth. So, mining is a huge process. It requires a lot of chemical and mechanical processes, a lot of machines, people, and it also requires a lot of land to dig these big open pits in order to extract the ores. This has a lot of negative environmental and also negative human impacts. So, one, mining impacts waterways in the fact that there's waste associated with all mining. They usually put them in these things called tailings ponds. Regulations have changed a little bit, so that might not be the modern practice anymore, but it was big. And these tailings ponds were these acidic things of water, and sometimes the dam would break and let loose all of this polluted water to the rest of the lands. Um, so that then poisons drinking water, and usually they weren't supposed to be making these mines upstream from anywhere, but that often happened as well. Um, and then again, the land becomes a sacrificial pit of just digging up these ores, and all of this together, it impacts the neighboring communities, and it disproportionately affects indigenous and poor communities. And poor countries are disproportionately used for mining, and they are much more unregulated than in richer countries. And this like isn't even accounting for all of the negative impacts on people who work these mines, all the violence that can happen from mines collapsing. Um, it really is just the tip of the iceberg. It has huge consequences on our planet and people. And there's some hope as tech waste is getting recycled and we can draw the metals from there. But the mining industry still needs to be addressed as well. So, I mean, as designers and developers, yeah, it's great. We can use renewable energy to power the servers, but then those servers kind of come from this very dirty, horrible place. Next, and it feels bizarre to say this, but the tech industry is not so efficient in the way that it's put together. So, manufacturing of the servers, computers, and other devices that we use on a daily basis is spread out globally. Um, Part of this is, I mean, due in fact that we can only mine in places that the ores exist, but there's a lot of ways that we can actually make this much more of an efficient process. Um, so various countries are involved at each step of the way, and all of this travel just causes increased emissions. Phones and computers are made up of a ton of different parts. I couldn't even tell you all the parts that they're made of. So with those parts, they're created of a few different metals as well and chemicals. So just as an example of where these metals come from, palladium is mostly coming from South Africa and Russia. Silver can come from um, places in all continents. Manufacturing happens in Korea, Taiwan, China, Thailand, Malaysia, and Japan. And then the assembling of those parts that were manufactured into actual devices takes place in Brazil, India, China, and Korea. So there's a couple of overlap places, but for the most part, it's spread out pretty far. And with that, we do have the increased emissions, but we also have the increase in the people that we need to make this process work. A lot of these things that are being transported are valuable metals. So they need security on these shipments to make sure that nobody's stealing these metals. And then chemicals that are transported, they need to be contained properly because if they interact with each other, they can cause harmful reactions. And then those different pieces of the devices that are manufactured, they need to be temperature controlled when they're shipped to the places that put the devices together. So there is a ton of extra energy being spent there. Um, and with this very spread out process, there's also a lack of transparency and accountability. When it's global like this, there's not really a global rule or guideline to follow to make sure that everything is being done ethically and safely. So it's never going to be as simple as point A to point B. Um, and maybe it's not fair to compare the global trade of physical objects to what we can do as web designers, but I still think it's so necessary to be aware of and to understand, and improvements can definitely be made here. Um, Next, the web is not so open of a place due to a few different reasons. Access to the internet has been closed off to many, which I touched on a little bit earlier. And then users are no longer solely in control of their data, and they're not even in control of what they actually see on their screens. So, for those that don't have access to high speed internet, there are millions of households in metropolitan and rural areas. Um, Rural areas definitely lack the infrastructure, and governments are kind of arguing about, okay, do we pay for it? Do we not pay for it? Who pays for it? Should we even do it? It takes a ton of resources to input the high speed internet. But then those in metropolitan areas, they don't lack high-speed internet due to just a lack of physical access, but usually it's just digital poverty. Their neighbors have access to high-speed internet, but then they just can't afford it. And I feel like this would be like living in a neighborhood where your neighbors don't have access to electricity or running water because they just can't afford it. And obviously, those are much more needed. But in our modern day society, especially in COVID times, internet has become a necessity. If you don't have access to high speed internet, students may have to drop out of classes or they can't sign up for the courses that they would like to take to better their future. Workers can struggle to find jobs without access to the job boards. And then they might also have to turn down certain jobs if that job requirement is you have to have high speed internet at your house. So it really, really hurts their economic prosperity. And also, developing nations lack access to high speed internet too. So, these examples with the metropolitan and rural, the numbers that I was looking at were in the United States, but other countries definitely struggle with this as well. So, those of us that do have access to high speed internet, however, the web is still not as open of a place as it should be. Um, One thing to look at is back in around 2018, 2019, it was discovered that employers were using Facebook to discriminate against women and older workers when they were promoting job ads. This was ruled illegal, and Facebook was told to update, which they said that they would do by the end of 2019. And then they didn't they did update, but it was found out in August of this year that you could still discriminate through their settings when posting job ads, housing ads, and credit ads, and those were the three that the judge was ruling on, because you can't discriminate with those things. And even outside of those ads, Facebook uses AI to try to show us what it thinks we want to see, which can turn into echo chambers, misinformation being promoted heavily to some people. It's kind of a whole mess, and it's sad because Facebook also thinks that more AI, better AI can help us out of this AI problem when maybe, okay, we need humans to actually step in and look at the ethics of this side because AI can't look at the ethics. They're just doing their job and hurting people in the process. Okay. Whew, halfway through all of these issues, I don't know if anybody else is getting depressed after this week of election, but this never fails to get to me. So the web industry is also not so honest. It commonly exploits workers, and tech companies have been offshoring a ton of their manufacturing, their assembly to China, to exploit them even more. So, for this example, we're going to take a look at Foxconn. If you're not familiar with Foxconn, they create products for Apple, Amazon, Dell, Nintendo, a few others. And they've been getting, rightfully so, getting a ton of criticism for a while now. Um, the workers at Foxconn are monitored, abused, and exhausted for profit. So, the monitoring, when workers enter the factories, they have to go through special security. They're not allowed to bring in phones, recording devices, or other metallic objects. And then once they get into the factory, the first rules are no talking, no laughing, no eating during work hours. The business model is also one that requires them to work for most days a month. Foxconn has very tiny margins of profit, especially when comparing them to Apple. Apple has at least 10 times the amount of profit margins that Foxconn does. And so they expect a lot out of their employees, and they do not pay them as well as they should be getting paid or treat them at all in general, how they should be getting treated. Back in 2010, there was huge news about the increased suicides that happened at some of these Foxconn factories. Um, it's just one of those things that is, it's still looking back, I can't believe this is what happened. But Foxconn, in response, instead of addressing these foundational issues, they just decided to put a band aid on the solution and install physical safety nets around the outside of the dormitories where the workers live so that if they jumped, they would be caught by these nets. And, that was like a decade ago, but workers are still being treated horribly. They've gotten some pay raises since, but the amount of work that Foxconn demands from them increases with those payments. So it doesn't really help anything. And Apple even has come out and said that they do not agree with the work conditions that Foxconn uses. But if they actually cared, then maybe they could, stop using Foxconn instead of just coming out with a nice PR public statement. Um, so it's downright awful. And the government is complicit in this as well over there. So Number 5, the tech industry is not so regenerative. And this is it's just frustrating to kind of look at. The rest have been like very disappointing, and this is more, I don't know, frustrating, at least for me personally. So, in a capitalist society, the primary goal of tech companies is to make profits, and this is often at the expense of people and planet. If we think about smartphones, on average, users upgrade about once every 2 years. But that doesn't stop big companies like Apple and Google and Samsung from releasing new flagship phones every single year. And it doesn't stop the cell providers like Verizon from promoting deals to try to entice you to upgrade. Innovation for the sake of profit is not sustainable. And that's basically what these smartphone companies are doing. None of us asked for like the headphone jack to go away. None of us asked for, you know, phones to get sleeker and sleeker. A lot of things that I think people have asked for is cameras and battery life, and those have been happening. But even now, if you look at ads for smartphones, the majority of what they talk about is the camera. And if that's all you're upgrading for, that is a lot of tech waste to throw away for a relatively small improvement over the long run. And then even with the upgrades, no phone that they make is going to be the same size as their previous model. So then you need new cases, new screen protectors, sometimes new accessories as charging ports and stuff change. So, what if there was another option? And there was in development, at least at Google, in the early years of the 2010 decade, they were developing Project Aura, which was a modular smartphone. So, new camera comes out, you just swap out your camera from your device, everything else stays intact. Your screen breaks, I'll just like put a new screen on it. Your processing power isn't what you want it to be, no worries, just swap out that module. Sounds wonderful, right? In 2016, they canceled the project, and this came about right when they were starting to tighten up more on their finances. So they, in turn, realized this was kind of a moonshot project, was not going to give them the financial return that they wanted, and canceled it, which is really disappointing because this would have been not only like really cool for tech people to geek out over, but it would have been awesome for the planet. And instead, Google put out the Pixel line, which I'm guilty of purchasing, but would have rather had the Aura. However, in Europe, I was seeing that there is a phone called a Fairphone that is a modular phone, not as intensive as what Google was doing. And I don't know a ton about it, but if anybody else does or has any reviews, like I have really high hopes that this is a great phone and that it will eventually make its way around the world. Um, Lastly, the tech industry is not so resilient. Maybe it is for the tech companies themselves, but for us as consumers, it's really lacking in resiliency. So, product hardware is becoming inaccessible to the average user, and it makes them slow to repair or replace. Apple is the biggest. Oh man, what's the word I'm looking for? Just completely blank. They're at fault here a ton with a lot of their products. Um, they kind of make it so that you can only get your devices repaired at an Apple store or at a repair store that is licensed through Apple. And if you look at it, only 271 Apple stores exist in the US as of August 2020. So that's not super accessible, considering there are a ton in California because that's where they started. And we all have accidents with our devices. We'll drop our phones, we'll shatter them, we'll spill water all over our keyboards or whatever. And then you're kind of left wondering, am I going to be able to do work today? Because you can't get this device repaired. And not only is Apple just okay with this inaccessibility, but they're actively promoting it and trying to make sure that this is how it stays. They are continuously lobbying against the right to repair law here in the USA, which the right to repair law would require electronic manufacturers to sell replacement parts and repair tools to the general public and independent repair companies. Um, there are quite a few people out there who I'm sure would love to be able to get the tools and the pieces to them so that they could repair their devices themselves if they feel comfortable doing that. But then just the increase in accessibility of businesses not only having to say, okay, we don't deal with Apple products, we only deal with like Android phones or Microsoft PCs or whatever. And they could actually start repairing these Apple devices would be wonderful. And they could do that without giving profit to Apple because that's what part of licensing with Apple does. And they could make whatever repairs they wanted, not just the ones that Apple says are okay. However, there is hope. Um, in 2018, Apple sued Henrik Huseby, who is an owner of a small electronic repair shop in Norway, and Apple lost. Apple was suing him over repairing Apple devices without having licensed with them, so over violating their trademark. But the courts ruled in Huseby's favor, and that is absolutely wonderful and a great step in the right direction. So it was great that he actually like fought this instead of just succumbing to the big corporation that was trying to bully him, and that gives some great hope for the future. So a lot of these points are kind of these big abstract ideas. Um, we don't personally have connections to mining or manufacturing or Apple. I mean, we use devices from these companies, but at times it can feel very powerless to look at all these things that are wrong in the world and feel like the only thing that we can do is really like hope that the pressure happens, or vote or whatnot. But I don't want to leave this as like this completely hopeless mess that's happening in the world. There are some things that we can do. Our actions as designers, developers, business owner, and just as people in general, we can create change in the world. So part of this is through education, raising awareness, which is why I wanted to talk about this in the second half of this webinar to really highlight some of these issues that maybe we don't think about or don't try to address. And some of that could just be because they're hard topics, both to learn about. I mean, my mood definitely tanked after researching a ton of this stuff, or just because some of it's maybe a little harder to understand or follow, or we feel like we can't do anything about it. So the education is a huge part of it. And then from there, I mean, voting is a slow process of change, but it does matter. And I'm so thankful for everybody that voted in this election that happened on Tuesday with the record turnout. Things can change from there. And then really just putting public pressure on these companies can go a long way. And as we as designers, developers, and business owners put these practices into our own business, we can slowly start raising the standard. So it's going to take a ton of different approaches from a ton of different angles, and it's going to take a lot of different people. So, as a positive, actionable note to end this, I have a challenge for all of you. That challenge would be to adopt a sustainable web resolution. That can be anything from I'm going to move my website to a renewable energy server. I'm going to go through all of my images and make them much more efficient and optimize them. Or, maybe you have a ton of pages on your website, so your resolution is to delete a page. Whatever it is, no matter how big or how small, find one thing of change that you can do. 2, share it on your social media. 1, because then it can hold you accountable if you publicly share it. And then 2, to create that ripple effect of letting other people know that these are things that they can be doing and should be doing to help raise that bar and to help make change. And then 3, tag me in your post because I want to see what you're all doing. I want to cheer you on and I want to be inspired by you. And I also want to shout you out. So find something and we can all make some great change in this, even if the bigger destruction feels like we maybe can't. And then the last thing I want to talk about is I actually have a green web design course coming out in early 2021. It's going to cover a lot of the concepts that I talked about in the second half of this webinar of what's actually wrong in the tech industry to just kind of raise awareness. But then it's also going to talk about what I talked about in the first half of the concepts behind green web design. And then it's going to go even further and give you actionable step by step guides and workbooks and tools and resources to make your website green and sustainable. Waitlist is absolutely free. There is no commitment that you have to sign up for the course if you sign up for the wait list. So if you're interested, definitely sign up and you'll be the first to know about all news and you'll get to have a little bit of input on the course as well. And I'm going to start sending out some surveys in a little bit. Um, so overall though, just like thank you all for coming here. This was fantastic and I will check out the questions in the chat. And then lastly, just so you're aware, I have my sources. And you'll get all of these as well. So stop sharing somewhere. Okay. So now I'll dig through these questions. If go through all of them, or if somebody has like a pressing one or has them like shouted out too, I'm okay with that. Um, Roll in all the way up. Okay. What is the best way to optimize our images? Is the Photoshop script okay, or is there a more efficient way to do that? Um, the Photoshop script is great if you're saving by web in Photoshop. There's also a plugin that you can download for Photoshop to be able to save your images out as WebP images if you want to move towards that file format instead of JPEGs. There's also online converters and optimizers like Tiny JPEG, Tiny PNG are pretty good. So it really just kind of depends on what way you want to work. I'm sure that there's one that might optimize better and it might be image dependent. But I personally love Photoshop because then I can like drag the quality around and see the impacts of it. So it's just kind of a personal preference, and one might be better than the other. I've seen reviews, some compress a ton more, but then you really start to lose image quality. So it's really finding that nice balance between them. I'm still struggling with understanding web-safe fonts and font licenses to use on websites. Are desktop licenses enough, or when do I know that I'm illegally using a font on websites? Hope that question makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. So web-safe fonts, I think so. Okay, let me wrap my mind around this a little bit. So some website fonts are going to be those that universally everybody has on their desktop. So those are going to be the generic Arial, Times New Roman, a lot of those things that you don't necessarily need an extra license for. You can just use, and people's computer will input them. For custom fonts, um, sometimes it kind of depends. I know there's been times where I've bought fonts off of like Creative Market, and I've bought the desktop license because I wanted to use them on desktop, but I also wanted to use them on web, but it wouldn't let me buy both. So I was under the assumption that buying one was like fine, and that might be incorrect. But it like literally would not let me buy the web version of it, and I'm pretty sure the desktop version came with some web safe fonts too. So really those that you buy for desktop versus those that you should use on the web, the biggest difference is their file formats. So on desktop, you might use like TTF or OTF or something, and those are usually bigger. There are WOFF and then WOFF2 as web safe fonts, and those are going to be much smaller and load much quicker. Oh yeah, there are the issues with the how many page views you have with web fonts. Yeah, it's kind of outdated and kind of irritating. The owning a domain name. Yeah, it's crazy how many web agencies I see that own web domains. And I was talking to some clients and they've had like hundreds of calls with their web provider to try to get out of their contract and like get their domain name back. It's terrible. Just learning about SVG for optional web scalability. How are these on Energy versus JPEG? Oh, good question. So SVG is really going to be better suited for things like logos, or if you want to use like some text that you don't want to load the full font up for, you can do that. But ultimately, it's very dependent on what you're loading. Some things like My logo as an SVG was a fine file size in comparison to a PNG, and it was much clearer and much crisper. And you can do some nice things of changing color of your SVG images through code instead of having to save out multiple files. So that's always nice. But if it's still a geometric type shape, maybe it's a little bit more complex. Saving it as an SVG is going to be a larger file size than a PNG. So it's very image specific, and it takes a little bit of playing around to fine tune what is working. And then SVG too, you have a couple of options. You can either input it in the image source tag just as an SVG, or you can open the code up and input the code into your website. I usually prefer doing the code part because I like to edit colors and such, but both work. What would be your advice on writing alt tags to be as accessible as possible, yet SEO appropriate? I see a lot of resources focusing on SEO practices, not the need for screen readers. That is a great question. Yeah, I'm not even sure if I have a good answer for that. That's something that I need to up on my web game too. I feel like because sometimes I kind of go under the impression of a lot of times context around the image of actual text in paragraphs and stuff usually help explain the image a little bit too. So it might be a case by case basis, but that is really good. And I will look into that, and I can, if I find a good resource, I'll email it out to all of you. So yeah, if anybody else has a better answer to that, please chime in. um, yeah, see, it's always better to keep text as text and not as an image, both as the web page and for accessibility. Yeah, that is definitely true. I've definitely cheated at that a couple of times, which maybe isn't the best practice. Yeah. Um, Death by design. Ooh, okay. I'll have to add that to my watch list. Oh, and that there is a good. If I would have kept scrolling, there is a good guide for how to do SEO page things. Okay. Is there a video conferencing platform that uses the least energy or renewable energy? Um, somebody on Instagram, at Green the Web, she just did a post on video conferencing tools. So um, definitely go check her out. I can try to pull up the link to her post too, because it was really good. There are actually a lot of video platforms that I didn't know about. And she's like killing it with all of her research on um, a lot of the platforms. So here, I'll put it in the chat. Here's the link to her post. And then, ooh, the captions happening automatically. Google captions are automatic. Oh, that's kind of nice, even if they maybe do suck. Okay. Philly is the worst for digital poverty, headquarters of Comcast and stuff. Oh, does Comcast pay taxes? I don't know. That's really sad though. Um, I'm gonna second otter.ai. It's been wonderful. Um, Fairphone. Oh, it's expensive and quickly sold out. That's actually kind of good to hear that that has some great response from consumers. Um, Apple does offer replacement through a mail-in repair service. Oh, that's nice in England. They might do that here too. I don't know. I know I've definitely mailed in devices, not Apple, but other ones. But I don't know. It's always such an anxiety-inducing experience to ship your device off and then be like, okay, hopefully I get this back when I need it. um, yeah. Okay. Which web host do you use for your website and client sites? So I use Green Geeks, and their service has been great. They are in my price point. However, they are not the cleanest one out there. They don't use 100% renewable energy. They draw their energy off the grid. I was emailing them a little bit about this because I was confused from their website. And where they don't use renewable energy, they offset their carbon 3 times over. Unfortunately, when I signed up for them, I didn't realize that there was like a bad way to offset your carbon. So I was like, that sounds great. So I'm planning on doing a little bit more research into that, but they've been pretty solid for me so far with hosting and everything. And once I can afford to move elsewhere, and have the time to, I probably will, but I just started my service with them in May, so I probably won't switch until then. Um, the image processor script in oh, not save as web. I don't what is the image processor script? I don't know what you're and that might be in my bed, but I don't know the technicals of that. Or if you can clarify with your comment, Emma. Um, image processor script. Or is that like a script that's like preloaded on their recording things that you can like automate? Oh, yes. Okay. It's built in. Um, okay, I'll kind of move on the topic of fonts, what's your opinion on Google Fonts? I actually love Google Fonts. I don't know anything about it in terms of sustainability, but I think that they have some solid fonts there. They're good free options, especially sometimes I get irritated with Adobe, and then sometimes I don't want to like dig through paid fonts, but I personally like them. I've used a lot of their fonts before. Um, yeah, I'm not sure on anything else though. I think that they usually load pretty well and low impact too. If you leave a lot of tabs open, that's wasting energy, right? It might be. I feel like that's probably because there's a lot of things running in the background, so I would assume so. I'm very guilty of leaving a lot of tabs open. Um, yeah. And then you can modify the quality of the video when doing video calls and meeting tools. So it's sending less data through the web. I guess it's making it more eco-friendly. That's something I didn't think about. When I even launched up today into Google Meet, I was like, ooh, do I like switch to high quality? And then I was like, no, it looks fine. So then I didn't want to mess with my camera or anything. But that's actually probably a good point that doing lower quality is sending less data through. Interesting. And I mean, I think it looks fine. Maybe some people have different opinions, especially as 4K screens become bigger. I kind of wonder how that's going to go. So, yeah. Is there any other questions? Otherwise, we can just kind of wrap up. And oh wait, I'm planning on creating an online directory for small businesses, and I was wondering if it's more sustainable to create a downloadable Excel document or if I should post the images of the products the business wants to offer on the website itself. Good question. Um, I feel hmm, I don't know how I feel like more user friendly is definitely going to be posting the images so that you don't have to download, especially if people don't have a great way to open Excel, or even just doing like a Google Sheets and maybe that's something that's accessible or doing them both in tandem. But I feel like having, I don't know, maybe like just grouping them and doing content based organization might be the best because then people are going to be on the topic that they want and do less scrolling and less clicking. But I'm not sure. I don't know how big. I mean, I'm assuming Excel documents are pretty small, but then that's also like the downloading. And then if it updates, they'll have to download another one. So that might be more issues logistically and end up with a bigger impact overall, even if it is a smaller file. Um, but good question. Interesting thought. Yeah. Um, Any other last questions? Otherwise, we can wrap up. You guys can get back to your days. But ultimately, like, thank you all for showing up and signing up. Um, the replay will be emailed out with the slides, and I'll see if I can add in some other resources too on some of these questions. So, yeah, thank you all.